Welcome to our Friendly Circle Berlin workshop. I'm going to turn it over to Ian McCabe.
Cody, it's great to hear you giving this talk tonight, and you've got a very relevant subject that has saved my life and perhaps some of the listeners as well. And the influence that Carl Jung especially had and understood in relation to alcoholism and alcoholics. He was the first one, Cody, that you have pointed out as well, who met the businessman and said to him, "There's no cure other than a spiritual cure." Now, this was a big deal in the 20s. This was around about 1926 when the Freudians were trying to become very scientific. And he said, you need a spiritual answer. But this actually goes back 2,000 years to Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, who advised his soldiers on how to stop drinking. And one of the things was, he said, to get a spiritual life, and how he advised that, ironically, was through reading. But Carl Jung actually then gave our friend Hazard the key, and Hazard passed it on through the Oxford group to Bill Wilson, who eventually got it from Ebby Thatcher. And I believe both of those men did go back to drinking, except Bill Wilson. And Bill Wilson founded the Great Fellowship of AA with over 2 million people. And we can attribute it directly to Carl Jung. Cody, the work you've done in relation to the tricksterish of the alcoholic, the archetype, the shaman, the healer, the self-healer. And I think it's wonderful that alcoholics have got this attribute within them to heal themselves and to be of assistance to others. And by being of assistance to others, they can, of course, be of most assistance to themselves. Your work, Cody, has brought new information to the field, particularly in relation to Carl Jung's trip to Mexico with Jamie. And I think this is highly valuable. What I wrote to you confidentially was that I learned more from your book by reading it than I would have in a month studying Jung at various universities. And I highly commend you very much to your talk this evening. And truly, you have just so much to give to the Jungian community. Thank you, Cody.
Wow, thank you, Ian. I'm so honored by the words that you've said. I can't even imagine. What a beautiful thing. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And it's nice to meet you. I look forward to hopefully meeting in person someday. So with that said, I'm just going to launch right in. And so Bill Wilson was the co-founder of AA, as Ian has told us, and he was such an astute observer of the inner workings of his mind that his book, Alcoholics Anonymous, could be considered a masterpiece in modern psychology. And yet he was an alcoholic, right? And so it seems that among psychologists in general, maybe not so much the Jungian community, there's been sort of a reluctance maybe to give Wilson the respect that I think that he certainly earned for the groundbreaking stuff that he reveals to us in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. In that book, Wilson elucidates many of the more shadowy elements of the human psyche that in a way that people like me, right, untrained and unsteeped in psychological theory, that we can understand and apply, right? And that application part, I think, is really important, right? Because there's so many of us that are people just like me who are able to access these deeper components of like psychological theory and Jungian theory and put them to the test, right? They have cash value, as William James would have said. It's an extremely pragmatic system that Wilson introduced. Today, I want to talk about some of those dynamics as they manifest through what I've called and what Ian referred to is the archetype of the alcoholic. And this we'll see is a modern variation of the shaman slash trickster energy that Jung wrote about and that we're familiar with. You know, everybody's heard of the shaman and the trickster. And in doing so, we're going to pull from quite a bit from the letters between Wilson and Jung, their correspondence in 1961, just before Jung's death. Sadly, Jung was to pass a short time later, but the information that he did leave us with his correspondence with Bill Wilson is really profound, and we probably owe our lives to it. So, and I do want to say this talk, as well as my talk next week, are based on my book, The Shadow of a Figure of Light, The Archetype of the Alcoholic and the Journey to Enlightenment. And I'm grateful to say that Chiron Publications has decided to publish it. I do have to mention too, the book was supposed to launch October 1st, but they are in Asheville, North Carolina, which just got hit by those horrible floods. So we had to postpone the book for about a month, but we're communicating again, and they're back in the swing of things. So moving right along. Bill Wilson in the big book, in which I refer to the big book, that is the book Alcoholics Anonymous. He writes that bottles were only a symbol. And as we look at Wilson's mythos from a more perhaps Jungian perspective, what we see is there was a lot more than just bottles that were symbolic in that book. In his 1961 letter to Wilson, Jung tells us that the alcoholic's relationship to alcohol itself has a symbolic significance. And he pulls that imagery from Psalm 42:1. As the hart panteth after the water brook, so panteth my soul after thee, O God. Now, Jung's basically telling us that just as human beings have this instinctual drive or thirst for clean, fresh water, even so we have an unconscious thirst for spiritual connection. And in the two letters that Wilson and Jung were writing back and forth to each other, they were discussing Roland Hazard, whom Ian referred to. And he, you know, like Ian said, he was a really significant player in AA's early history. And actually next week, if you guys can join us, I'm going to talk more about some of that history and some of the things that I was able to find through my research that really kind of help us understand the ancestry of the 12 steps. So in that letter that Jung wrote to Wilson, he says, Roland's craving was the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, expressed in medieval language, the union with God. And so basically what happens then is, in a very real way, the spiritual thirst that all humans shares seems to be projected almost into the bottle by certain people who might identify themselves as alcoholics. And like I said, we're going to dig into these letters as we go. So if we use a similar psychological approach, we can formulate another aspect of Wilson's mythos symbolically, and that's the character that I've called the anonymous alcoholic. Wilson sort of calls him this. He says the AA, right, in 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. But this character, the anonymous alcoholic, was a character that Wilson purposely crafted as a psychological mirror for his alcoholic readers. And as we get into this, we'll see that character reflects the human longing and our failed hope to reach the divine, just like the characters of ancient myths were meant to do. If we go a step further, then we can take the universality of our spiritual thirst for wholeness and view it as sort of a prototype for this human longing for spiritual connection in the world today. And as we do that, Wilson's character becomes archetypal. Okay, and then what emerges then is what I've called the archetype of the alcoholic. And it's surprising to me that, so far as I can tell, nobody has written or spoken much at all, if at all, about the archetype of the alcoholic. And I saw this thing on TikTok the other day. This woman said, you know, the greatest minds don't know what to do in the face of addiction. And I just think that's a profound statement. And I think that has a lot to do with the reason why so far the archetype of the alcoholic has remained below the surface of consciousness. Jumping right in. Archetypes are primordial images, meaning they exist, as Wilson would say, deep down in the psyche of every man, woman, and child. Carl Jung tells us that as a mythological motif, an archetype is a continually effective and recurrent expression that reawakens certain psychic experiences or the formula or else formulates them in an appropriate way. And there's a few examples of how this manifests in modern culture. So first of all, it's important to point out that the archetype of the alcoholic has been recapitulated in over 400 sister fellowships. That's important because that shows us that it's a recurrent expression. And importantly, each of these fellowships deals with an issue other than alcoholism. The other thing that's important is that some of these fellowships they use the basic text. They use the book Alcoholics Anonymous as their basic text. And so they're already seeing the words alcohol, alcoholic, and alcoholism as religious symbols or expressions of their own longing for wholeness. They're already using the word and the phrase and the symbol of the alcoholic as an archetype. And then finally, too, it's important to point out that denominations from every major religion have adopted the 12 steps as a spiritual practice. So that, too, is another sort of, evidence that this symbol is a continually recurrent expression. Now, archetypes by nature, they're bipolar, meaning that there's a positive and a negative aspect. There's like a high, Jung often refers to it as the highest and the lowest. And most of us are familiar with the negative aspect of the archetype of the alcoholic. And what I show in my book is that this negative aspect of this archetype grows out of our culture's lack of an effective or meaningful mythology. As a culture's religious myths lose sway, a compensating energy wells up in the collective psychology as overpowering primordial forces meant to drive us toward wholeness emanate from a darker, more archaic aspect in the psyche, influencing certain individuals so profoundly that they become acutely neurotic, which often manifests as alcoholism and or addiction. So alcoholism thus becomes a symbol not just of our individual thirst for union with God, but it's actually a metaphor, if you will, of our culture-wide lack of mythical connection. The Indians of the Great Plains provided a disturbing case in point about this. So the US government decimated their God image, systematically slaughtering the sacred buffalo. And as they did so, alcoholism and addiction emerged as a widespread chronic illness amongst the tribes. It became an epidemic. This is a photograph of 15,000 buffalo skulls. And it was a devastating campaign. We're going to talk more about that next week as well. Having witnessed the murder of their mythological symbols, the tribespeople lost a vital connection with the Great Spirit. And in their longing to find what went missing, a deadly and destructive compulsion emerged from the depths of their collective unconscious, erupting into a culture-wide epidemic. And what we see is happening in the West today is basically the same thing, right? And Jung refers to this sort of particular manifestation of the thirst for wholeness. He calls it an eruption from deep within the unconscious psyche. He tells us spirit is also the source of inspiration and of enthusiasm because it is a welling up. The German word Geist, i.e. spirit, is a volcanic eruption, a geyser. That aspect of the spirit is the reason why alcohol, for instance, is called spirit. Alcohol is the reduced form of spirit. Therefore, many people lacking spirit take to drink. They fill themselves with alcohol. I have seen many a case of that sort. It is typical for men, though women do it too. And so, in other words, if symbolical symbols or imagery is or mythology isn't erupting from the depths of the collective unconscious, then what erupts is a neurosis, right? And Jung tells us that this is typical. And so this alcoholic condition it crosses many cultures. And that without a mythological container to contain those emergent energies from the unconscious, basically what happens is the person, some of us, many of us, it manifests as a neurosis and turns into alcoholism. Those energies emanate from a deeper, more archaic place in the psyche. So there's evidence of the existence of the archetype of the alcoholic all around Western psychology. So the mysticism surrounding intoxication in Western culture is indicative of the presence of this archetype. And so we see it celebrated in many of the characters we hold to be wise and dear, right? So we go back all the way to the Greeks. Dionysus is evidence of the archetype of the alcoholic. There's also other characters in literature. So two that came to my mind were the Miller in the Canterbury Tales, very old character, definitely alcoholic, most likely. And then also my favorite is Shakespeare's character, John Falstaff from Henry IV. John Falstaff is considered by many Shakespearean academics or scholars to be Shakespeare's most profound and most witty character. He's even there's sort of this like funny tradition, I guess, that somewhere in the back of Shakespeare's mind, I guess, Falstaff was teaching Hamlet the ways of being a human in some bar somewhere in the back alleys of London, right? So Falstaff was such a profoundly good character that he actually was Hamlet's teacher, right? But and what's memorialized in these characters is the ancient wisdom that comes from heeding the darkness of human nature, right? And these characters have these things in common. They hang out with criminals, they're friends with prostitutes, and probably and they often, very often, use intoxicants, right? And so and what's sort of celebrated here is that the connection that one gets to humanity when they're willing to go into the darkness. There's also there's examples of this archetype in modern culture. So Walter White, Tony Soprano could be two. I'm not big, really super hip on pop culture, but like, you know, in rock stars, we see it. Jerry Garcia, Kurt Cobain, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix. So these people would all be associated with the archetype of the alcoholic. They all love to party, they use drugs, and they died early. But on top of that, anytime we seek to deepen our spiritual connection through the use of psychedelics or some other form of intoxicant, we are channeling the power of this archetype. So, for example, wine at church is indicative of the archetype of the alcoholic. Another example, Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, which was a best-selling book. He makes the case for the use of psychedelics as a way to increase one's connection to spirituality. I see in my TikTok feed almost every day Jordan Peterson talking about taking psychedelics and how influential and moving it is for a person to imbibe in psychedelics. So this is all indicative of the archetype of the alcoholic. William James was actually a person who used nitrous oxide as a means. You know, he would huff nitrous, he would hit whippets, right, as a way to connect with the archetype of the alcoholic, or to connect with the mystical. So we also see the use of psychedelics in therapy. We see the use of psychedelics in some post-Jungian circles. We see microdosing in these big corporations. Also, ketamine treatment now is like, Ming was telling me you can get ketamine now at your Botox clinic. And so it's sort of everywhere in our culture, right? And of course, with all these examples, we would be remiss if we failed to mention Bill Wilson's own foray into the world of psychedelics in the 1950s, which at that time also incidentally happened to be a culture, not like a culture-wide phenomenon, but it was something happening in the culture. There's articles written in Time and Life magazine in 1957 that talk about using magic mushrooms. And so Wilson wasn't alone in this sort of in his depth into the psychedelics. So and I want to read, so this comes from Wilson's second letter to Jung, dated March 20th, 1961. And this is actually available now. This letter is available online. I think actually Ian just published a paper about it. So, and this is what Wilson says in that second letter to Jung. He says, some physicians see a spiritual significance in LSD, holding that it temporarily triggers a change in blood chemistry that inhibits or reduces ego, thereby enabling more reality to be felt or seen. So Wilson's mention of more reality seems to come in response to something Jung had said in his letter, where he basically puts forth that these mystical experiences, these vital spiritual experiences that change people, have to come to one in reality, meaning the ones that come to us while we're intoxicated don't count. And I think what Wilson's doing is trying to challenge that perspective a little bit by giving his own experience and saying, hey man, when I did this stuff, I felt more reality. The other thing that Wilson alludes to here that's very important that we're going to build on for a few slides now is his discussion of the reduction of the ego. And that's a really important concept in terms of psychological change. So he's referring back to something he said in his first letter, and I'm going to read that now. So Wilson writes to Jung in January of 1961, that reading this book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, gave me the realization that most conversion experiences, whatever their variety, do have a common denominator of ego collapse at depth. The individual faces an impossible dilemma. So Wilson here is perhaps unwittingly describing both the negative and the positive aspects of the archetype of the alcoholic, and how through the archetype of the alcoholic, we can both understand as well as experience ego deflation. And Wilson does mention here that his reading varieties pointed out to him the fact that ego collapse is also a universal aspect of psychological transformation. So now we're going to move into some Jungian kind of theory, I guess. Jung also dealt with the concept of ego deflation. And he writes, such dilemmas, perhaps like alcoholism or some that all of us have, such dilemmas confront us in situations where there are insoluble conflicts. This means, in other words, that the ego is a suffering bystander who decides nothing but must submit to a decision and surrender unconditionally. So in terms of like a psychedelic trip, then the ego becomes a suffering bystander because it's forced to really just sit there and endure all of the energy that emanates out of the unconscious, right? Due to the psychedelics. And so that is an experience, and it certainly reduces ego. But once a person realizes that in reality, they are also a suffering bystander, in other words, stark raving sober, we're also a suffering bystander and must submit to a decision and surrender unconditionally. This is when we begin to tap into the deeper transformative powers that can come to us through the archetype of the alcoholic specifically. We've got to define what the ego is, though. And I'm going to say this, that Jung defines the ego differently than certainly what I was used to when I discovered Jung, and perhaps what many of us are kind of used to. But I think we want to set our preconceived ideas aside for a minute and just let Jung kind of tell us what he thinks the ego is. That will help us to unlock this stuff a little better. Jung says, by ego, I understand a complex of ideas which constitutes the center of my field of consciousness and appears to possess a high degree of continuity and identity. Things are conscious to me only insofar as they are related to my ego, but inasmuch as the ego is only the center of my field of consciousness, it is not identical with the totality of my psyche. So, in other words, the ego is the part of the human psyche that extends as far as the limits of one's own conscious awareness. Okay? This means that it encompasses our likes, our dislikes, our attitudes, our behaviors, our relationships, right? And I'm probably oversimplifying it, but it's pretty simple to just see the ego as a metaphor for consciousness. And that so everything we're conscious of is related to the ego. Now, in contrast, we have what Jung called the self with a capital S. And this would be a personification of the unconscious, right? So everything within the human psyche that falls outside of the realm, outside of the ego's realm, that would be considered the realm of the self. Jung tells us, I distinguish between the ego and the self, since the ego is only the subject of my consciousness, while the self is the subject of my total psyche, which also includes the unconscious. In this sense, the self would be an ideal entity which embraces the ego. So just to explain that last part, the self is the total psyche, right? And the part of the self that is conscious is what we call the ego. The rest of it is the unconscious. And grasping the self versus the ego will help us to understand our own relationship to the higher power, and especially sort of what's happening to us as we work the 12 steps. Now, so I said that ego is a metaphor of consciousness. The self then is a metaphor of the unconscious. And this really brings us to this point where the language and the writings and the ideas of Carl Jung were so impactful for me personally, right? Because Carl Jung figured out that he could use mythological images to examine and study the hidden dynamics of the human psyche, right? By definition, the self is unknowable. It exists outside of the realm of consciousness. So the ego cannot understand the self. The self is transcendent. But Jung recognized that myth is like the imprint that the collective unconscious leaves on the natural world. And it's almost like footprints or like scent that the ego can sniff as it's trying to kind of figure out what's happening in the hidden parts of the psyche. This is what Jung says. All ages before us have believed in gods in some form or other. Only an unparalleled impoverishment of symbolism could enable us to rediscover the gods as psychic factors, that is, as archetypes of the unconscious. Heaven has become for us the cosmic space of the physicists, and the divine empyrean a fair memory of things that once were. But the heart glows, and a secret unrest gnaws at the roots of our being. So the question then that we're really kind of looking at here is the relationship between the conscious, between consciousness and the unconscious, and whatever is that secret unrest that Jung talks about. Because that secret unrest, that's the longing for wholeness, right? That's the craving for alcohol. And what we humans, right, used to understand as the gods, has now, so because like, so in the Greek pantheon, for instance, there's like a god for every attitude, a god for every bad behavior, a god for every good behavior, right? And so when a person was being driven or whatever, it was just simply the god's fault. And then we, in our era, right, Carl Jung comes along and also Bill Wilson, and they say, no. That thing driving you actually exists within. It's part of you, and it's called the self. So as we look at the relationship between the ego and the self, or the consciousness, of consciousness to the unconscious, what we're looking at from a more sort of spiritual or religious perspective is the relationship of our will in life to that of the care of God. Okay. And Edward Edinger, who's one of my favorite authors, he wrote a book called Ego and Archetype, which I highly recommend. He builds on Jung's method of examining the psyche through mythological imagery. And he says that the self is the supreme psychic authority that subordinates the ego to it and is identical with the God image. Now, when we begin to see myth as a window into the psyche and that it illustrates this ego-self dynamic, what comes right to the front, right, is what Jung called that secret unrest, right? And I love this painting by Michelangelo because he really gets to this concept. Okay, Edinger tells us the ego's relation to the self is a highly problematic one and corresponds very closely to man's relation to his creator as depicted in religious myth. Indeed, the myth can be seen as a symbolic expression of the ego-self relationship. Now, as we look at this ego-self relationship in myth, we want to point out that the human characters like Adam and Eve, Noah, Moses, Melchizedek, whoever, Jesus, right, and the anonymous alcoholic, those human characters are all representative of the ego. And whenever there's a symbol of God present, that is a representation of the self, right? And so we see this, and I love that we see this in the 12 steps, that we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. We came to believe in a power greater than ourselves. We made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God, right? So the we of Alcoholics Anonymous, mythologically speaking or psychologically speaking, is a representation of the ego, while God is the higher power represents the self, the supraordinate psychic authority. What underlies this psychological dynamic, right, this sort of push-pull between consciousness and the unconscious, is what I've called the mystery of compulsion. And I took it from this quote from Jung, which is one of my favorites. It says, compulsion is the great mystery of human life. It is the thwarting of our conscious will and of our reason by an inflammable element within us, appearing now as a consuming fire and now as a life-giving warmth. Now, Jung tells us that compulsion is the great mystery of human life. And I think that we can make the conjecture based on our 12-step experience that for a person to become aware of his or her compulsions is to make the greatest leap in consciousness that a person can make, right? And in terms of like a religious idea, it's the same as becoming one with the gods, right? And the essence of step one is to get a handle on these compulsions, right? We admitted we were powerless and that our lives had become unmanageable. And I find it quite interesting that it appears to me that Jung sort of had the same struggle that we are so familiar with as we carry the message, right? I mean, for us, it's almost impossible. I mean, we go to these detox facilities and these rehabs and we share our experience. And these people have burned their lives to the ground. And like, we cannot convince them that they suffer from the mystery of compulsion. We're trying to tell them, you're powerless, you're powerless. There's a part of your psyche called the alcoholic mind that keeps driving you to do this. And it's almost impossible, right? And I imagine that Jung felt a similar sort of difficulty trying to get his clients to see the mystery of compulsion. And very often it feels like our neuroses develop out of a denial of the existence of this compulsive nature. I love this. Jung talks about the violence done by the self. He says there is a diabolical element which is a part of every psyche, which is the fiery center in us from which the creative or destructive influences come. The experience of the highest and lowest both come from the depths of the soul and either bring the frail vessel of consciousness to shipwreck or carry it safely to port with little or no assistance from us. The experience of this center is therefore a numinous one in its own right. Compulsion is the basis of our thirst for wholeness, right? That spiritual thirst, but it's also the basis of our actual thirst for water. Compulsions are extinctual drives, and the ones that occur maybe in the spiritual realm are meant to lead us towards union with God. Bill Wilson also speaks of our being driven, right? We're driven by fear, self-seeking, self-pity, and resentment. And I love the fact that in the 12 steps, we're so familiar with the idea of compulsion that we have a catchphrase for it: obsession of the mind. We just say, oh yeah, it was obsession of the mind. And we're very clear about the fact that the mind can have an idea or an obsession and that the body will follow. And I find that, so I've done some work in therapy. And I just now started working with the Jungian therapist. But what I find in therapy is it's dealing with the same thing. It's that in my personal relationships, right, mainly like with my wife, that I tend to, like, something triggers me and then all of a sudden I'm just kind of reacting out of this old idea or this like adaptive posture, right? I'm being driven by something unconscious, something in me that I can't see. And these compulsions stem from a deeper, darker, more archaic aspect of the psyche, and they're pushing us towards wholeness, right? They emerge out of the self. Wilson calls this same phenomenon the alcoholic mind. And he went on to explain, when we became alcoholics, crushed by a self-imposed crisis that we could neither postpone nor evade, we had to fearlessly face the proposition that God is either everything or else he is nothing. God either is or he isn't. What was our choice to be? And the archetype of the alcoholic then helps us to understand the purpose behind the self's insidious ploy of literally sending us right into the eye of the storm and facing certain devastation, shipwreck, right? The point of this, we can determine, I guess, is, or at least it's been in my experience, was to lead the ego into a psychological dilemma or an impossible crisis, right? That I couldn't think my way out of, right? The ego encounters a situation that there is no logical answer, right? And the ego is so hyper fixated on rationalism that the only way the self can wake the ego up is to basically trick it through experiencing one of these psychological dilemmas. Now, and alcoholism is only one. There's many psychological dilemmas. the collapse of the ego is represented in myth by spiritual death, right? That, and what it is we go back to the myth as a window into the psyche, right? And God forces the humans into this sort of spiritual death. And I want to read this. This is out of my book. Every adventure into the world of spirit involves certain violent death before the promise of renewal is bestowed. Even Jesus's father, the God he called love, in the end demanded his blood. In refusing to limit our understanding of myth to the often glossed over cultural interpretation, we must acknowledge that there is nary a single religious myth that does not escalate into a violent and bloody mess, reflecting a difficult truth about the dynamic that exists between the ego and the self. In my mind, one of the most impactful aspects of 12-step spirituality is that it has retained this essential component of this dynamic, this violent and dangerous kind of interaction that the self and the ego are engaged in. And, you know, this is not pop psychology, nor is this pop religion, which is everywhere, right? It's like this quick ticket, oh, you'll be fine, like just pray and whatever, right? Like this is real dark and dangerous work. And I love that this sort of dynamic is hidden in plain sight within the 12 steps. It's right there in step 3. Maybe you've noticed, but Wilson suggests that we make a decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of God, right? And it struck me one day that implicit in that suggestion is the idea that God very well may do more damage, and that we're to turn our will and our lives over regardless. And the thing about it is, engaging with these unconscious compulsions is always a dangerous proposition. I heard once that Jung had said that the person who comes to me for analysis takes his life in his own hands. And I think we can say the same thing about the 12-step fellowships, right? This really is, it's dangerous work, but it's very forgiving, right? If we survive. Psychologically speaking, like I said, spiritual death is equivalent to the deflation or the collapse of the ego. Edinger describes the inflated ego in ways that are super familiar to us in the 12 steps. He says the inflated ego suffers from an assumption of omniscience. Its total being and experience are ordered around the a priori assumption of a deity. So Jungians will say that the inflated ego is unconsciously identified with the self, which is a symbol for God. When we're born, and the way it goes is that when we're born, we don't have an ego. Everything is unconscious, right? For the baby. But as the child grows, the ego grows alongside it, and the ego kind of grows away from the self, except it remains unconsciously identified with it, right? And this is a state of mind that exists well into adulthood, especially among alcoholics and drug addicts. And individuation is the process of the ego waking up and waking out of this delusion of sovereignty. That's what James Hollis calls it, a delusion of sovereignty. Like Bill Wilson said, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. And at base, the case that I've made and the way I understand it through my experience in the 12-step fellowships is that the inflated ego suffers from a delusion of control. So it could be over alcohol, it could be over drugs, it could be over people, it could be over gambling, whatever it is. But that the ego deludes itself into thinking it has control. Therefore, the 12 steps are the myth of many compulsions, right? They're meant to address that delusion of sovereignty, and that's why they're so effective. And underlying this sort of myth of many compulsions sits the archetype of the alcoholic. The anonymous alcoholic is a spiritual prototype, and the journey he passes through on his way to the rooms is one that everyone experiences to one degree or another. Step 1 depicts the deflation of the ego, the psycho-spiritual death, whereby the ego relinquishes its assumption of omniscience and finally admits it is powerless. Then the self can start guiding the ego toward greater self-realization, toward a spiritual rebirth and awakening symbolized in the remaining 11 steps. And so, like in the 12 steps, we say that the ego needs to be right size. I think another way of understanding that would be to say that the ego needs to realign itself in its relationship to the self with a capital S. So and this sort of differentiation between the ego and the self takes place when the ego realizes that it suffers from a delusion of control, or that there's a part of the psyche that is sort of driving it and making decisions. That's sort of that's the split between the ego and the self. When the alcoholic, for example, recognizes that they're powerless over alcohol, they understand, oh my gosh, I have an alcoholic mind, it's driving me. So, but like I said, in order for this to happen, the ego has to be tricked, right? It has to be tricked into seeing really that it suffers from a delusion of control. And so, and I write this, the mechanism in the mind that deludes the anonymous alcoholic into thinking he will somehow someday control and enjoy his drinking is the same one that tricks all of us into believing that our ego is steering the ship, that we have ultimate control over every aspect of our lives. And thus enters the trickster. And the trickster has to trick the ego into basically into an insoluble dilemma, right? And these insoluble dilemmas, they're sort of they're unique to each individual, and they always center around some moral or ethical behavior, right? And whatever it is, yours is different than mine, but what happens is we continually betray ourselves. The ego betrays those duties that it feels like it has. It's a continual betrayal. Like in Alcoholics Anonymous, they say, I kept drawing a line in the sand and then I would cross the line. Like, I'll never do that. And then I did that and I drew another line in the sand, right? So the ego is continually tricked. It's being tricked into basically behaving behind its own back. And eventually this shocks the ego out of its delusion of control. And Jung referred to these conflicts as conflicts of duty. And and Jung tells us that the phantom of the trickster haunts the mythology of all ages, sometimes in quite unmistakable form, sometimes in strangely modulated guise. And the case that I've made in my book is that the archetype of the alcoholic then is the modern costume that the trickster has donned. The trickster has a very old history, right? But as such, the alcoholic becomes perhaps one of the most powerful symbols in the modern psyche for us to understand the relationship between the ego and the self. And it does this by elucidating this very ancient trickster complex. Now, the trickster, like the alcoholic, bedevils us into believing that we are making choices when really we're being driven by an unconscious component. Really, it's an instinctual drive for wholeness. And Jung tells us about the trickster that it represents a summation of all the inferior traits of inferior traits of character in individuals. So here's the thing. The shadow is also very apparent in the life of an alcoholic, right? So there's a clear correlation between the trickster alcoholic and basically what is called the alcoholic trope, right? And so the alcoholic also represents a summation of all the inferior traits of characters in individuals. And I think there's some irony that takes place here regarding the trickster complex, right? So, for example, these ketamine clinics that I was talking about. So they're giving people ketamine intravenously, and I don't know a lot about it, but what I've read on the internet is very interesting. The clinics are really they're really putting out there that their treatment is non-addictive, right? And yet they're they're not giving a lot of credence, I guess, to what perhaps alcoholics and drug addicts have to say about treating addiction with a chemical. It's an interesting conversation, right? But the way I see this is like giving somebody an addictive substance in very low doses and telling them that they won't get addicted to it is it's a way of like trying to trick the trickster. And for people who unconsciously identify with the archetype of the alcoholic, it seems that the only way through is to just go deeper into the darkness. And we talk about this a lot in the 12-step fellowships when we say, oh, he's not done yet, or she's not done yet, or we'll tell newcomers, go get done and then come back to us, right? Because we just know, like, there's nothing you can do. That the person has to suffer enough that they wake up out of their delusion of control. Jung said that, he says, compulsion is the great mystery of human life. And so if we're trying to like access the archetype of the alcoholic while also like trying to deny the aspect of compulsion, I just don't know how effective we're going to be. Now, regarding the shadow is the part of the self, the part of the unconscious that sits closest to the surface of consciousness, right? And the work of coming to, right, or coming to believe or whatever, or, you know, waking up, individuation, spiritual transformation, it always starts with shadow work, or like making the shadow conscious, becoming, you know, aware of those negative aspects of ourselves that basically everybody else can see but us, right? And Jung says that generally speaking, this part of the process is actually fairly easy. With a little self-criticism, one can see through the shadow, so far as its nature is personal. But when it appears as an archetype, one encounters more problems. In other words, it is quite within the bounds of possibility for a man to recognize the relative evil of his nature, but it is a rare and shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. And I wonder if for those people who have already become sort of unconsciously identified with the archetype of the alcoholic, like I said before, the only way through is to go deeper into it until they actually do have to stare into the face of absolute evil. For me, that's where the archetype of the alcoholic led me, right? Is to see that that evil exists in me, that there was a part of my psyche that would have killed me if it could. Therefore, one of the primary functions of the archetype of the alcoholic is to illuminate the shadowy, compulsive parts of the psyche that remain eclipsed behind a delusion of control. And the 12 steps are really effective at helping us to begin to recognize and deal with the personal shadow. And underlying it, right, is the archetype of the alcoholic that's sort of driving us towards an experience of wholeness. Like the alcoholic, the trickster, both of them have a dual nature. And so anything we say of the trickster, we can just say of the alcoholic. They're basically the same energy. Jung says that the trickster has a fondness for sly jokes and malicious pranks. As a shapeshifter, he is half animal, half divine, and exposes himself to all kinds of tortures. The trickster is approximated to the figure of a savior. In its negative aspect, the trickster component shows up as sort of that animalistic drive that dominates a practicing alcoholic, right? But then on the flip side, we have the trickster as being compared to a savior. In other words, that's the person in an AA meeting that says, you know, my name is Jojo and I'm a grateful alcoholic, right? That's an understanding of this sort of dualistic nature of this alcoholic of the archetype. In all its maliciousness, the trickster has a higher purpose, right? It tricks the ego into coming to terms with we call it the delusion of control, right? But really the problem that all humans suffer from, not just alcoholics, is lack of power. Lack of power was our dilemma. And the whole point of religion and spirituality and psychology is to allow us to tap into this power and how to harness the power, right? And that's kind of where we're going to kind of filter into now moving forward. Jung explains, only out of disaster can the longing for the savior arise. In other words, the recognition and unavoidable integration of the shadow creates such a harrowing situation that nobody but a savior can undo the tangled web of fate. And so we begin to see inklings of a metamorphosis. In the same way, the deadly trap that the alcoholic sets is meant to awaken us to an awareness of our spiritual thirst. And both the trickster and the alcoholic are ambivalent. They are uninterested in whether we survive the attack. The only sort of, I guess, purpose that they have is to try to wake the ego up from its delusion of control. The bottle, therefore, becomes a symbol of the deadly weapon that the trickster complex assaults us with. Wilson explained it this way. Faced with alcoholic destruction, we soon became as open-minded on spiritual matters as we had tried to be on other questions. In this respect, alcohol was a great persuader. It finally beat us into a state of reasonableness. Sometimes this was a tedious process. We hope no one else will be as prejudiced for as long as some of us were. This painstaking work that we're describing here of ego deflation is one which only the self has wisdom, patience, and mercy to carry out. And for alcoholics, the self does the beating, the ism is the hammer. And regarding the dualistic nature of these unconscious psychic complexes, Jung explains the essential content of all mythologies and all religions and all isms is archetypal. The archetype is spirit or anti-spirit. What it ultimately proves to be depends upon the attitude of the human mind. Spirit and instinct are the most polar opposites imaginable, as can easily be seen when one compares a man who is ruled by his instinctual drives with a man who is seized by the spirit. So we see this so clearly in the rooms, right? There could be a person who's a total alcoholic and has burnt his life to the ground and spent years and years out there on the streets or whatever. And then they come in and they get sober, and suddenly they're exercising monkish discipline in their approach to spiritual principles, right? So we see that a person ruled by his instinctual drives and a man who is seized by his spirit. But Jung goes on to explain more about this sort of phenomenon of metamorphosis. He says, just as between all opposites there obtains so close a bond that no position can be established or even thought of without its corresponding negation, so in this case, also les extremes se touchent. I don't speak French. The opposites are so close they could touch. They belong together as correspondences, which is not to say that the one is derivable from the other, but that they subsist side by side as reflections in our own minds of the opposition that underlies all psychic energy. And so what happens here is the mystery of compulsion then is activated on both sides of the psychological spectrum. On one hand, it's the instinctual drive, and then on the other hand, it manifests through spiritual vocation, and both are compulsive. And he alludes to the opposition that underlies all psychic energy. So that energy underlies everything in the universe. We see these opposites manifesting everywhere. And just like in nature, right? It's these things are there. There's a higher and a lower. But they're not seen as good and bad in the cosmos, right? It's only the ego that sort of pretends or suggests that one is better than the other. So Jung explains, man finds himself simultaneously driven to act and free to reflect. This contrariety in his nature has no moral significance, for instinct is not in itself bad any more than spirit is good. Both can be both. Negative electricity is as good as positive electricity. First and foremost, it is electricity. The psychological opposites, too, must be regarded from a scientific standpoint. True opposites are never incommensurables. If they were, they could never unite. All contrariety notwithstanding, they do show a constant propensity to union. The medieval mystics define God himself as a complexio oppositorum. And so here we start to see why both the highest and the lowest are necessary. Because when we can, so the whole goal of sort of the process here, and Wilson alludes to this, is we found a middle position safe and protected, is that we want to channel both of these into a common channel. In the letter to Wilson, Jung refers to this conjunctio oppositorum. In that, it's really in that paragraph that all of us love so much, if we're familiar with the letter. It says, you see, alcohol in Latin is spiritus, and you use the same word for the highest religious experience as well as the most depraved poison. The helpful formula, therefore, is spiritus contra spiritum. Now, we typically translate this to mean that we need to combat alcoholism with spirituality, right? And I guess that's true to a certain extent. But I think what Jung is getting to a little deeper here is the notion of the conjunctio oppositorum, which is where it's the conjunction of the opposites. And what happens here is when we recognize that our most depraved aspects of ourselves, our secrets, all that stuff we do when we're driven by instinct, that is as much a part of our spiritual journey as anything we discover when we come over into the light, right? And Jung tells us that both can be both. One is not derived from the other. One is not better than the other. One's not good. One's not bad. They're both part and parcel, and they almost exist as correspondences, right? Like if we were to take time out of the equation, then for the alcoholic, drunkenness and sobriety may exist on the same plane. And Wilson talks about this. He says that our most horrendous character defects become our greatest assets because with them we can avert death and misery for others. And Jung said that what happens during the conjunctio is that even the pathology itself takes on a numinous character, meaning that it just becomes that the neurosis becomes part and parcel of the spiritual awakening. Spiritus is Latin for breath, right? The breath of life. And spiritum, as far as I can tell, the at the end is the possessive. So it means to be possessed by spirits. And I think another thing that Jung refers to here, which I really like, is really, it's kind of like the juxtaposition of the evil spirits that Jesus encountered during his ministry, that he, tossed out of the pigs and the humans and whatever, in contrast to really what is the Holy Ghost, right? And that even the word or the phrase Holy Ghost has this sort of paradoxical ring to it, right? Who ever heard of a Holy Ghost? And in this quote, Jung builds on that idea just a little bit. He says, if we look back into the past history of mankind, we find a universal belief in the existence of phantoms or ethereal beings who dwell in the neighborhood of men and who exercise an invisible yet powerful influence upon them. These beings are generally supposed to be the spirits or souls of the dead. Spirits, therefore, viewed from the psychological angle, are unconscious, autonomous psychic complexes, which appear as projections because they have no association with ego. In other words, as long as we're unconsciously identified with the archetype of the alcoholic, then we're essentially projecting the spirits of this, the spirits of the psyche or our own demons into the bottle in a way. That's a way to see it. In terms but here's like a deeper idea, is that in terms of the self, that both spirits as well as the Holy Ghost both stem from the same source, that of the self. And so a conjunction of the opposites occurs, right? When we begin to understand that there is neither high nor low, right? That both can be both. We start to discover the great reality. And I love this quote from Wilson. He says, our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. They arise out of ourselves. And the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he usually doesn't think so. And I would dare go so far as to say that it's not just alcoholics and drug addicts who usually don't think so, regarding the ego and the self. What we're trying to figure out then is that, for me, this sort of goal of this spiritual walk is to begin to understand that both my troubles as well as the solution have arisen from within me, and they come out of this self. And when we realize that both the highest and the lowest stem from the same psychic center, then we're on the path towards wholeness. Jung explained what wholeness is. So, and I'm referring back to the Jung letter, where he says Roland's craving was the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness. Here, Jung says, in the empirical self, light and shadow form a paradoxical unity, while in the Christian concept, the archetype is hopelessly split into two. Wholeness is the birth of the self. And so the self, both the self and the alcoholic, are images of wholeness because they both incorporate the highest of human nature as well as the lowest of human nature. And Jung tells us that essentially the conventional Western notions of God or the higher power, they fail to do that, right? They lack wholeness in the psychological sense. In other words, Jesus was a character only of light. He didn't have any darkness. And on top of that, the people who formulated Christian dogma centuries ago, they diminished the devil's power, right? By trying to eradicate the symbol. And I talk about this in my book. It's kind of a deep concept. Jung tells us that the path to enlightenment diverges from where we thought it would go. He says one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And this is why we need both sides of the polarity, right? And when he says we make the darkness conscious, that begins with shadow work, right? And the idea is that we're trying to conjoin the unconscious with consciousness. And I want to point out that this is the process of the 12 steps. For example, step 11 says that we sought to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him. When we look at that from a Jungian perspective, when we recognize God as a symbol for self, then what we see is step 11 really says that we sought to improve our conscious contact with the unconscious. And that really is a Jungian myth, right? And I'm going to talk about the Jungian myth next week. So what we're speaking of here again is the conjunction of opposites. And in this quote, Jung tells us then exactly how this works, right? When these two bipolar energies come together into a common channel. He says, if the mediatory product remains intact, in other words, if the symbol isn't split, like the way the Jesus symbol is split, it's just a figure of light. He tells us if the symbol remains intact, if, like, for example, the alcoholic archetype remains intact, it has the highest and lowest. So does the self. There's a highest and a lowest in the self. So if the mediatory product remains intact, it forms the raw material for a process not of dissolution, but of construction, in which the opposites both play their part. In this way, it becomes a new content that governs the whole attitude, putting an end to the division and forcing the energy of the opposites into a common channel. The standstill is overcome and life can flow on with renewed power towards new goals. And so what happens then is this, if lack of power is our dilemma, and none of us could find power in conventional religion because they were hyper-focused on the figures of light, when we come into Alcoholics Anonymous, we unconsciously encounter the archetype of the alcoholic. We see people say they are grateful alcoholics. And so we begin to, there's sort of this distillation of this paradoxical symbol, right? And it begins to harness both sides of this energy into a common channel, and we begin to recover and we tap into that spiritual power that we couldn't find anywhere else. Unlike the Czar of Heaven, right, which is Wilson's term for the conventional religious conception, the trickster, the alcoholic, and the self are all images of wholeness. And as we go through this, we begin to see this metamorphosis that begins to come about, right? And therefore, Jung refers to the trickster as a savior. We read that earlier, and I'm going to kind of go back to that now. He says, there is something of the trickster in the character of the shaman and medicine man. He is the wounded wounder who becomes the agent of healing, the sufferer who takes away suffering and who turns the meaningless into the meaningful. So in indigenous tribes, for example, the trickster is very often called to be a shaman, right? Because he or she has learned from personal experience how to harness the dark energies of the psyche and thereby generate transformative power. I find it also fascinating that in indigenous cultures, trans people, who what we would call trans people today, or like asexual people, they would often be the trickster because they essentially incorporate or encompass this conjunction of opposites. So they're seen as wise because they draw a line between the middle of the two polarities. The alcoholic is also a modern shaman. Escaping a previous way of life dominated by instinct, the shaman masters the magic art of healing, which in the context of spirituality is only discovered by ingesting the most degrading poison, metaphorically speaking. The alcoholic is thus a shapeshifter, and as the carrier of spiritual boons becomes the symbol of the savior, the bringer of healing to the tribe, an element of which clearly constellated in Wilson's mind when he devised the anonymous alcoholic's heroic adventure through the 12 steps, ending with his 12th suggestion that after one has had a spiritual awakening, one carries a message of wholeness to others suffering a similar fate. And, you know, just to put a plug out there for the 12 steps, when a person has become unconsciously identified with the trickster, it's probably best to turn them over, at least for a time, to the shamans, right? Who understand the nature of this trickster complex so well, which in the 12 steps, we do understand the nature of this trickster complex. It's almost like written into our DNA here. Jung says that the trickster is a negative hero who manages to achieve through stupidity what others fail to accomplish through their best efforts. And I relate to this personally. You know, this is the nature of sort of the recovery that we experience in 12-step fellowships, right? Wilson says that you know, these transformations are happening on a wholesale basis, and it's like, yeah, not everybody finds recovery who comes into the 12-step fellowships, but those of us who have found recovery and who will, we literally utterly transform our lives. And it's the paradox there, right? Of this, the fact that, like, as really kind of like stupid, selfish, self-centered, careless people, right? There's some sort of divine accident that happens, and we come in and we experience these profound life-changing events. Like I said earlier, the trickster has a very old history. 70,000-year-old history. And I think it's the oldest archetype. And over the millennia, it's been variously portrayed as a joker, a clown, and a court jester. And in the modern costume that the trickster dons, he brings a similar levity to the role. And Wilson tapped into this as well. And you can hear this in the music of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Wilson says, and the music of Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, is when you walk into the fellowship hall and it's just really loud and everyone's laughing really loudly. And then, and as Wilson says, we think cheerfulness and laughter make for usefulness. Outsiders are sometimes shocked when we burst into merriment over a seemingly tragic experience out of the past. But why shouldn't we laugh? We have recovered and have been given the power to help others. And Jung says that the anecdotes of the trickster, the stories of his journey into the darkness, lead us to wonder what happened to his evil qualities, right? And the modern shamans in the rooms of 12-step fellowships, they're able to use the keen sense of humor that they've adopted regarding those tragic moments of the past, right? And it's almost like soul surgery, you know? They cut open the heart and mind of a newcomer just enough to let the medicine seep in, right? And that laughter disarms them, and they're able to see things from a new light and begin to actually experience a conjunctio, right? Regarding their own pathology. And that medicine is the stories of what we used to be like, what happened, and what we're like now. And I have written here that it's the tale of the transcendent experience that no one understands, even those of us who have experienced it, or even those who have experienced it. In conclusion, in its negative aspect, the archetype of the alcoholic inspires our misguided attempts to fulfill what Jung called in the Wilson letter an unrecognized spiritual need. But it also reflects the safe passage through the middle of any psychological crisis of opposites that defines a spiritual journey. The alcoholic is thus a modern image of wholeness. It entails coming full circle, and it is a prototype of transformation in the modern era. Stephen Herman, who is a great Jungian scholar and a friend of mine, wrote this: unconsciously identifying with any archetype of the collective unconscious can be dangerous psychologically. Becoming conscious of one's shadow is perhaps a more modest way to achieve a wider consciousness of the wholeness of the personality. And Stephen Herman is clearly right here, right? Except I think what we understand in the fellowships is that unconsciously identifying with an archetype of the collective unconscious, it is dangerous, right? But it's also highly effective. It's a highly effective method of spiritual transformation. And so one of the greatest assets that most of us had was that we were willing to really turn our will and our lives over to the care of the archetype of the alcoholic without reservation. And by tapping into that extremely dark energy, we were able to experience a transformation. And the thing that leads to the psychological crisis is the thing that eventually sets us free. And and that darkness is really the seat of profound spiritual energy, power, and vitality. And when we harness it with our images of light, we really are setting ourselves upon the path towards wholeness. And in conclusion, the 12 steps, even with its inadequate conception of God, has proven to be adequate enough to save millions because it is accompanied by that paradoxical image of wholeness, the archetype of the alcoholic, whose transformative power we experience consciously for the first time when we finally utter out loud words that spark an immediate expansion of spiritual consciousness. I am an alcoholic. And again, the archetype of the alcoholic is a paradoxical image of wholeness that generates spiritual power. And it's an ancient image that has power to transform the psyche, which surprisingly can take place even if we remain unconscious of its presence working in our lives. And I do thank you guys for coming. So all of this, again, is based on my book, The Shadow of a Figure of Light. Ian and Jay both wrote blurbs for it, which you can see here. The complete blurb is in the book. The book is available at cody-peterson.com as well as chironpublications.com. And anyways, but I'll stick around.
Cody, wow. What more can I say? Wow.